Hi, welcome to my first inaugural episode of Kidon, War Stories on the Cutting Edge of IP Monetization. My name is David L Cohen. I am the owner of Kidon IP, a consultancy, and David L Cohen PC, a law firm, where we provide IP monetization services to clients both large and small. Every episode, I will interview other subject matter experts and leaders in the wide range of prosecuting, asserting, analyzing, monetizing, and defending intellectual property rights. You can find this show on multiple sources, including YouTube, LinkedIn, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and many more. Today, as probably is appropriate, my guest is an old friend of mine from way back, Donal O'Connell, who has saved me from many, many challenging situations in the past, and so is a fitting person to start off this podcast. And we will be discussing intellectual property risk management. Donal is the managing director at Chawton Innovation Services. He's a former director of IP and ex-vice president of R&D at Nokia. And for many years, he has been an IAM top global IP strategist. And he specializes, amongst many other things, in IP risk management. So, Donal, give us viewers in the interwebs a little background about yourself and how you came to be where you are today, and then let's jump right into IP risk management.
Hi, David. Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. First, I should explain I'm, like many people, we're working from home these days in the United Kingdom. So welcome to my home. I hope the lighting and sound is okay. I'm not in my normal office. And but yes, IP risk management. Yeah, it's an area that has been of interest to me for a long time. I suppose one advantage I had is coming out of research and development and moving into IP. I had been very familiar with the idea of risk and risk management, having come out of an R&D environment. So when I moved into an IP environment, I was extremely interested in, well, how does the IP community go about understanding IP risks, managing them, analyzing them, calibrating them, mitigating, and so forth. So I probably got stuck into IP risks very quickly when I transitioned from R&D across into IP. And since that time, I have spent a lot of time thinking about that particular process. And of course, in more recent times, we seem to be getting more interest in this topic. So it's been an aspect of IP I've been interested in probably from day one.
Well, so you're an engineer by training, I believe, if I recall correctly, and in R&D you did a lot of our engineering and engineering management, and if I recall from our Nokia days, I still have the Finnish accent of the word process hammered in my head. What is the process and the process of doing this, that, and the other thing, and so maybe give a little background into how you think perhaps you sort of engineering training and the at least at the time, the Nokia obsession with process and process management sort of impacted your thinking about IP risk and how that might play out today in management of IP risk. Because most people who are asked to task on it, at least in my experience, are tasked with dealing with IP risk tend to be lawyers who might not have the same exposure to process management as engineers.
Well, a process at its most basic is a way of doing certain things. There are inputs and there are outputs. Now, in the world of IP, we're already familiar with processes. There's a process to do IP creation. For example, if you look at patent creation, the input would be an innovative idea and the output would be a granted patent. Or it could be a suggestion or a name or a brand, and the output would be a registered trademark. So we're already familiar with processes in the world of IP. We perhaps don't think about it so much, but there are activities you have to master. And there are a number of key processes you have to master in the world of IP. You have to understand how to create IP assets. If you have a collection of IP assets, you have to understand how to manage a portfolio management.
Yes.
You have to understand how to exploit them, how to bring value to the business. So there's the IP exploitation process. Many IP assets have to be enforced by the IP owner. So there's an enforcement process, or how do you protect what you have? And there's a risk management process. Now, the risk management process if you break it down, is the input is either an actual risk or a potential risk that's IP related. And the output, hopefully, is that risk properly mitigated. Now, an example of an IP risk. You may get an assertion letter claiming that you are infringing somebody else's patent. Well, that's not a good letter to receive, so you know already you've got an issue or a risk facing you. But it's not the only type of risk. You can have your employees stealing a trade secret. You could have an issue where you're designing a website and you're not certain about the images you're using and whether you have permission to use that copyright images. You may have embraced open source software and not understand that there are licenses associated with open source code, and you may not have understood those licenses or be complying with the terms and conditions of those licenses. So you have lots of different types of issues that can cause disruption or pain or damages to a business. And the IP risk management process is about A, identifying those risks, B, doing some sort of analysis to determine, okay, what is the real nature of this risk? Is it a genuine risk? Just because an engineer stops you in the corridor and says, I think we infringe a patent belonging to somebody else, doesn't actually mean you infringed a patent, because the patent may have expired. You may already have a license. So you have to do some analysis. You have to determine the nature of the risk in terms of, well, is it likely to hurt us tomorrow morning or in 5 years' time? What's the impact, the probability? And then what do I do to navigate around this risk? You might decide, well, actually, this risk is so minor and the impact is so small and the probability is so small, I won't do anything. But as we've seen more and more, the value of companies these days is in IP, therefore lots of the risks to do with IP. So it's best to really take time to understand the nature of the risk and determine, do I need to do something? And that doing something may, again, be a variety of different steps. It might be, I need to take a license. It might be, I need to do some design around of my product or service. It might be, I need to go off and try to invalidate the other person's IP. It might mean I need to educate my own employees about the importance of trade secrets and prevent some of them from walking out the door. So depending on the nature of the risk, the action you take to mitigate it will vary. And of course, you may depend on some third party. You might take out IP insurance, or you might depend on some indemnification clause in agreement. So the actions you will take can be quite varied. And of course, the action you will take will vary depending on the type of risk. So in terms of a process, it is the risk that's coming in at one side, and the output is whatever action you've taken to successfully make that risk go away in one way, shape, or form. And that's a process. Just
Right.
like an idea coming in the door and a granted patent is a process. But I don't think the risk management process is that well understood in the world of IP. It's not thought of like that, whereas the other processes like creation or portfolio management are. But I believe it also has to be mastered.
You know, I think one of the things that might contribute to that is, and it's something, again, I learned at Nokia, which is that lawyers especially are trained to win the battle in front of them, as opposed to the larger war. And so when they're presented with an IP risk, for example, they have to fight that particular risk, and they do whatever cost-benefit analysis they do as sort of an individualized risk, and they handle it sort of in a piecemeal fashion, typically, especially when they come from an outside counsel environment. Whereas, you know, we learned in Nokia that sometimes you have to lose a battle to win the overall war.
Yeah.
And there's larger concerns that a big sprawling company as Nokia was when we worked together there in 2010 or so, whatever it was, that it has, which sort of leads to which makes sense because, again, it's a publicly traded company. It has to identify business risks, and IP, I guess, is a business risk. And it has a large staff of folks in the IP space who have to be managed purely as an HR perspective. But if you're managing HR, you're managing what are they doing and what are they taking care of, which is all sort of a lead up question, which is that, okay, a sophisticated company like a Nokia can think about IP risk, even though they may not do it properly. But what are the larger lessons for sort of smaller companies, and how should smaller companies who may just have a general counsel or a single patent prosecutor in their IP department, how should they consider IP risk and what should they do, and maybe leaven this a little abstract discussion with some stories about the various kinds of IP risks and what they can do about it.
Yeah. Well, you raise an interesting point about that many tend to operate in reactive mode, and maybe it's the training of the legal community within the IP sector, but I think it's human nature as well. I mean, if you analyze the psychology associated with risk, a lot of people will assume that risk happened to others. It'll never happen to me. And even if it does happen to me, I'm in a much better position to handle it compared to anybody else. So
Right.
psychology, it does play a part here with IP risk. And some people don't see anything wrong with firefighting. But firefighting is fun for a while, but after a while it'll wear you out, and eventually some fire will hit you that you just can't put out. So I'm a fan of proactive mode. Now, it isn't like that the IP community has to invent the wheel. There are lots of other corporate functions out there and businesses who do understand the proactive approach to risk management. In fact, there are well-defined standards out there. ISO 31000 is a generic risk management standard that is fairly high level, but it says, okay, if you're facing risks and you're facing more than one risk, here's the approach you should take. Here's a process. Here's an approach you should take, so that you are not in firefighting mode. But I do agree with your initial part of the question that I do see lots of people in the IP community seem to be quite comfortable operating in reactive mode and think that's the norm, and they look at the risk in front of them. Now, the challenge when you don't have to be a very big company to suddenly understand that you actually probably are facing a lot of IP risks. I mean, there's lots of evidence out there that if you're an innovative creative startup or a scale-up or an incumbent type company, the value of your business is these days linked to your intangible assets. We hear numbers like 80% of the value of companies is their intangibles, and only 20% is intangible, is tangible assets.
Right.
Well, if you just take that sort of simple maths, well, if 80% of the value of your company is to do with intangibles, I would argue that probably 80% of your risks are probably to do with intangibles. Now, you could argue it's not 80%, but it doesn't make any sense to say that 80% of the value of your company is intangibles and 0% of your risks are intangibles. That
Right.
just doesn't add up. So whatever the number is, a significant percentage of the risks facing companies these days link in some way, shape, or form to the intangible assets, either registered IP like patents or trademarks, or unregistered like employee know-how, trade secrets, copyright, or whatever. So you don't have to be a very big company to suddenly realize, actually, I'm probably facing numerous IP-related risks. Now, I don't know about you. I can barely remember what I did last weekend. So I like to be organized, to help me get organized. So having, first of all, some sort of register or database of what are all of the issues I'm facing, what sort of analysis have I done of those risks, and who's doing what to help me mitigate them, is sort of good practice.
And
that's what that's what all risk management is. It's about getting organized and getting structured.
And that's what I like about your sort of innovation, which is I think the big innovation of Chawton Innovations is to how people see the forest for the trees, and that's sort of an inside joke because I know you like to name your various modules after trees.
Yeah.
But you've developed a whole bunch of tools that basically allow, to put it simply, easily keep yourself organized about the various categories of risk associated with different subsets or global aspects of IP, and sort of organize it as a risk register, as you like to call it, and sort of allow you to keep track of it and allow you to search it and to organize it and get an analytics based on it. And it doesn't add too much to the day-to-day activities of a IP professional to utilize software like yours or any other software to sort of keep track of these risks. And so maybe we can dive in and examine some of the trees in your forest, but maybe you can tell us a little bit about how you got to to create some of them, and
there were
give a little example.
Well, there were sort of two roads to Damascus moments that prompted us to think about developing this. First of all, I had established with some colleagues a dedicated IP risk management team within the IP function at Nokia. But sometime previously, we had already gone paperless in the IP department. And one day I turned up in an office in Espoo near Helsinki to discover the risk team, these 4 or 5 folks in that team, still using pen and paper. And I sort of said, hang on a second, I thought we went paperless. Why are you using pen and paper? And they said, well, what else do you want us to use? We don't have a dedicated risk tool. So we had other things to worry about. So I sort of grinned and bared it. But it always struck in my mind that the guys doing IP creation, patent creation, doing IP licensing, and so forth, they had all these nice tools. And this small dedicated IP risk team who were doing some great work were still on pen and paper. So it stuck in the back of my mind, well, really, we should think about some way to help them automate or help them to become more efficient. But we didn't, and for other reasons. Then after I left Nokia, I was doing a project for a music technology company. They're now part of the Apple empire, but they were independent at the time. And I was brought in to help the general counsel. So in that company, the IP and legal were together in one group. And they were the most stressed IP function I've ever met in my life. I mean, just sitting in the room with them, you realize that something was not quite right.
Right.
So I had a coffee with the general counsel. I said to her, okay, what's going on here? Like, something is not quite right. And she said, well, we're just in a very stressful situation. We're a technology company. We're in the music sector. We're growing fast. We have patent issues. We have trademark issues. We have copyright issues. We've got know-how. We got trade secret issues. We got domain name issues. We got social media handle issues. You name it, we have it. I said, okay. And I said, when you say issues, can you just give me some examples? And she gave me some examples, which in my mind was, okay, these are risks, either potential risks or actual risks you're facing. Right. So I said, fine. And I said, what's your risk management process like? Can you explain to me? And she laughed and said, Donal, I don't have time for processes. We're firefighting. So I said, okay, let me help you get organized. And then as we started getting organized, I realized that actually, she made a comment in, I think, either that meeting or a subsequent meeting. She said, well, actually, my real problem is I'm surrounded by alpha males. And it stuck in my mind. And I'm thinking, sorry, what did you say? And she said, Donal, you got to understand, if I have a risk in front of me, an IP risk, I typically know what to do to solve it. That's not my problem. My problem is I'm surrounded by alpha males. And I said, I'm sorry, I said, this is going way over my head. Can you explain to me what your concern is? She goes, well, I'm on the executive board, and the rest of the company knows we have these IP risks. But when I present to the board, they either, every time I mention an IP issue, their eyes glaze over or they panic. So they're stressed. They're adding to my stress. So I said, well, what do you present to them? And she said, well, whatever's the fire that's hot at the time, I present to them. I said, well, look at it from their point of view a second. What do you think is concerning them? And when we explored that, we realized what was concerning the interface between the general counsel and the rest of the board was the rest of the board were not convinced that she was organized. And also, they found it very difficult to understand because every time she presented, she seemed to be talking about a different risk. Well, today we got this patent risk. Yesterday we had this copyright risk. Now we got this trademark risk. So from those people in the board, they got the impression that the general counsel was disorganized and couldn't communicate about the big picture. They couldn't see the wood from the trees. And I said, well, your problem isn't just IP risk management. Your problem is communication. You need to be able to show them that A, you're organized, and B, that you can separate the wood from the trees. You can say, see this risk here on this copyright image on the website. Don't worry about it. See this risk here with this patent infringement letter. That's what we got to worry about. So you got to be able to tell them what's really happening with all these risks and which risks are high impact and high probability and where they've got to pay attention. and which risks you and your department will take care of. They don't have to worry about it. And so risk management isn't just about the process. It's also about communicating with key stakeholders, and particularly the board or investors or whatever.
Or insurers, or
Yeah, and the problem was, because a lot of the stuff was in her head or in emails, she probably could handle individual IP risks. But to somebody look from the outside looking in, it looked like she was disorganized. Hence her
and
comment, I'm
presumably
surrounded by.
she couldn't really look at it over time.
She couldn't look at it
And
over time. She couldn't separate it. So we put an IP risk management process in place. We put a basic risk register, which in essence was no more than taking a corporate risk register and putting a user interface, an IP related user interface on top, to say, this is where we're going to track, this is where we're going to analyze, this is where we're going to store the data, and this is from this tool we're going to run reports. And you're going to start, before you jump into the detail about one particular risk to the board, we're going to give them the big picture. Say, this is the big picture. Now we're going to talk about this particular risk. So they could now see the big picture, and they could see how a particular IP risk fitted into the overall portfolio of all the risks facing them and what options. So her issue was she needed to get organized and she needed to communicate better. But you can't do that if you're disorganized. And the nature of and they weren't that big a company. I mean, they were a 100 headcount at the time. But they were a technology company. They were in different jurisdictions. And you don't have to do too much business to suddenly find yourself facing a few patent issues, a few trademark issues, copyright issues, employee turnover, which is know-how, trade secret issues. And of course, if these days companies aren't islands, they collaborate with others. So they had issues with some university collaboration partner, with some technology provider. Before you knew it, she was probably having to handle a dozen, 2 dozen, 50, 100 different IP risks simultaneously. And
right.
You can't do that in the back of a cigarette packet. You have to get organized, and you need some tools to help you to do so.
No, totally.
That was the background to that.
And I think one of the great sort of innovations, and maybe we can talk about this very briefly, that sort of is a happy byproduct of the risk register you set up, is that when you talk about IP risk, it doesn't matter what the kind of risk it is. You're talking about some of the most sensitive secrets that a company may have. And what your tool allows you to do, and what having a risk register allows you to do, is to talk about the risk without talking about the nature of the risk, without talking about the risk itself. Using, and you like to use the term metadata, to talk about the various risks or various things that you put into this registry, which then gives you a method of collecting information about these various risks that they can be presented to third parties, whether they are, whether it's in the context of a trade secret, or whether it's in the context of an M&A, or whether it's in a context of an insurance dispute, and it allows you to sort of ring fence sort of the core concerns of a company with lots of different concentric circles of information that is usable, and allows, and it opens up a lot of doors to a lot of interesting possibilities, whether it's collateralizing your trade secrets without having to actually tell the trade secrets, whether it's allowing for better insurance policies, and so maybe you can speak to briefly a little bit about that.
Well, obviously, if you're putting all of this, let's call it metadata about your risks into a register, you've got to think about, after a while, you build up quite a lot of data. So you've got to be very careful as to who gets access to this and how you share it with others and so forth. But of course, by having it in electronic format as well, you can filter it and sort it. So you can limit the amount of information certain key people see. They don't need to see everything, but maybe they need to see the big picture, or they need to get an overview of a particular risk without actually reading the detail of the third-party patent or the claims or whatever. So you can control who sees what. And of course, particularly if you're in a litigious environment, or these risks could substantially impact the nature of the business, you've got to control stuff as well. And I think by having it centralized in a register that you control, you're much more capable of doing that compared to lots of emails going around, or post-it notes or whatever. You are in control. So I fully agree with you. Being able to, it might sound strange, but having a lot of data about your risks, some people might say, isn't that a red flag? Wouldn't we better having no data? I'm not a fan of that. I much prefer to have lots of data, but have it under control, in a place where you can control access and you can control how the data was entered, how the data was manipulated, and how the data is reported out, and so forth. And it allows you then to filter or sort it depending on the audience, because obviously, there are key people that will have to be informed about certain types of risks. Obviously, the board, maybe key roles in the organization, but also third parties, your external IP advisors, maybe IP insurance, litigation funders. These days, no IP department is an island that you connect to so many others, but you've also got to manage the flow of information that goes out or comes in, but definitely you want to control the stuff that goes out. And having a good metadata allows you to do that.
Right. And as we've talked about many times over the years, since we've talked about you going down this path, it's a nature of risk that people are always, human nature is backwards looking. And so we're always fighting the last war, right? And we're always coming up with risk prevention strategies that last burned us. And as you know, and I know, most companies don't concern themselves with IP risk and they're in firefighting mode. And so both you and I in our various different domains have been doing a lot of consumer education and education more generally about IP and IP risk and the nature of things that companies should be concerned about and why. And so, with that introduction, I'll do a little sales for you. You have a whole series of modules about IP, various aspects and various IP risks as sort of educational that can be used in multiple contexts. But why don't you tell the viewers a little bit about, we've been talking in the abstract, what you're doing nowadays, like who are your clients nowadays and what can you do for them?
Well, there are three parts to the business: education, consultancy, and a collection of IP tools and solutions. Definitely the tools and solutions part has grown, definitely grown fast during the COVID period. In terms of clients, we work with small SMEs, scale-ups, and incumbents. But actually, these days, we also have a number of IP firms as clients, so our client base has also changed. I suppose in terms of, apart from risk, what are the other things we're really interested in? We are, a couple of years ago, we got heavily interested in what was happening in the whole area of trade secrets and employee know-how, an unregistered form of IP. This was very much a neglected stepchild of IP up until recently, but in a very relatively short period of time, we've seen dramatic changes in this form of IP. The US law has been enhanced, but also in Japan, China, and Europe, trade secret laws have enhanced. We've seen an increase in trade secret litigation. We've seen maybe certain type of technology that's been embraced by certain companies lends itself more to trade secret protection rather than, let's say, patent protection. So trade secrets have gone from being the neglected stepchild to really an asset you have to think about. But of course, it depends on whether you're looking at it as one advantage of trade secrets is you have no interaction with the Patent and Trademark Office. But one disadvantage of trade secrets is you've got no interaction with the Patent and Trademark Office. So in a sense, you've got to act like your own IP office. You've got to determine, okay, what are going to be my policies and procedures, and what records am I going to keep about these assets, because nobody else is keeping these records for me. Whereas with patents and trademarks, you have an 800-pound gorilla beside you holding your hand. Now, you may not like it, but the good thing is, in a sense, they hand you the process. They say, here's the process to look after patents, and here's the process to look after trademarks. With trade secrets, you've got to do it yourself. So one of the areas we're heavily involved in is developing systems and tools to help you identify and classify, log and track your trade secret assets, because you have to do it yourself. So that's one area that's become really important to the business. Another area that's become important is this whole area of getting employees to have a better understanding of what IP is all about, because IP unfortunately is complex. I mean, I describe it as like a three-dimensional game of chess where you're playing multiple people simultaneously. I mean, you've got to, first of all, get a basic understanding of the different forms. Well, what is a patent? What's a trademark? What's copyright? What's trade secrets? Then you've got to get an understanding of, okay, well, what's the difference between creating the IP and then enforcing it or exploiting it?
Right.
We've just talked about the complexity of risk management. But then you've also got the fact that there are these different IP models out there, open source, licensing, litigation, Creative Commons, open access. Well, how do you use these models to your advantage? So getting employees to have a basic understanding of IP is very important, because remember, IP by its very nature is dealing with innovation and creativity. So what's in the minds of the individual. So the employees have to have a basic understanding. Now, you see other functions embrace e-learning approaches. I mean, health and safety, diversity training, anti-bribery training. Very few companies are doing this with organizing classrooms where you're invited to turn up on a certain time and day. More and more are realizing, well, I've got an e-learning management system. Why don't we do some of it at least online? So we have designed and developed a quite comprehensive suite of content, videos, short papers, and also quizzes that cover a range of different aspects of IP. It does the basics. What is a patent? What's a trademark? Of course. It does what are the processes. It does what are these models. But it also looks at, let's say, more interesting things. I mean, we've just designed a set of videos on the ethics associated with IP. What are the ethical issues regarding patents, regarding trademarks, regarding trade secrets, regarding licensing? We're just reviewing a video at the moment on the whole issue of patent pools. What's that all about? And what are they there for? And how do they work? And what's the pros and cons? So, it doesn't take long to build up. If you break IP down into its constituent parts, you can be up to 50, 100, 150 different topics before you know it. I mean, our plan is to get to 100 different modules by sometime in 2022. So we're realizing that there's already gaps in our content, and we need to finish that. And I suspect that come 2022, we'll find more gaps, because.
And how long are these modules?
Well, each bite-sized video is 3 minutes. So it takes a topic and explains it in simple terms in 3 minutes. The quizzes then align with each video. So you also go through half a dozen questions. So once you watch a video, did you understand it? Because, of course, unfortunately, some employees will cheat. They'll turn on the video and then go off and get a coffee, not watch it. So we want to understand, did they actually understand the basics of what is a patent or what is a patent license or whatever? So and then for people who are less interested in the video and like the more reading, we have short papers, so 3-minute reads. So bite-sized videos, short read papers, and quizzes that consist of both a mix of basic and more advanced scenario type questions, where a basic question would be like, okay, what's the definition of a trademark? But then a scenario would be, okay, imagine you're doing this and this and this, and you're collaborating with this company. What would be the implications of this from an IP point of view? So it puts you in a scenario and then asks you to say, pick the right answer. What would you do in this situation? But the whole idea is to get employees to have at least a basic understanding and appreciation of what is IP. Of course, there's nothing stopping the IP department complementing it with classroom training or whatever. But, it's tough being an in-house IP department. I mean, we talked about Nokia, but Nokia was the exception. I mean, we had, 400, 500 people in the IP department at its peak. Most in-house IP departments are 0, 1, 2, or 3 people.
And they're overworked.
I mean, I don't meet many IP managers who turn around complaining about the fact they've got additional resource. They're wondering what to do with them. That doesn't happen.
Right.
So if you're an IP manager and you have a mid-sized company with R&D in New York and a factory across the border in Toronto and sales in Mexico and R&D establishment in France, and you're told, I need to raise the awareness of IP across all of the organization, you're thinking, well, my company's 5,000 employees. They're in 20 locations, and they don't all speak English as their first language. That's a tough task.
Yeah, that is really tough.
Particularly when I've also got to worry about the patents and the trademarks and the risks and so forth. So, the clever companies are realizing, well, many of these, particularly the medium and large size ones, already have the infrastructure. You already have the e-learning management platform. It could be LinkedIn Learning or Moodle or SAP Litmus or something like that. So you already have the platform. You just need the content. And it needs to be content that's appropriate to the non-IP person. What you don't want to do is develop content that teaches the employee how to be an IP attorney, because that's going to turn off the engineer or the marketing guy. They just want to have a basic understanding of what is it and what have I got to pay attention to.
Got it.
And
No,
then, of
that
course,
makes a lot of sense.
And if I need more stuff, well, then I can go talk to the experts.
Just know what you don't know. Yeah.
So employment is becoming a key part. And then, of course, we're always fascinated by just the fact that software is more and more eating the world, and open source is a big. So,
right.
I mean, open source many people outside of IP may not think about it, but open source is an IP model. I mean, just look at and read any of the open source licenses, and suddenly you're realizing I'm dealing with IP here.
Mm-hmm.
So we're also very interested in what's happening with software. I mean, let's call it digital or data, but anything that's digital in nature. What are the IP implications? So we're busy.
No, that's wonderful. So if I may summarize, because we're sort of running out on time here, Donal, although as much fun as it is to chat, you sort of have three primary prongs. As you said, you have the educational pieces where you have a suite of little modules of different sizes for different contexts, and papers as well on different topics of IP. You have a suite of tools that effectively are registries of different aspects of IP and IP risk management. And then you offer consulting that both is educational as to what IP is, but also how to utilize the tool, how to think about IP risk, IP management, and sort of get companies on the right track. And assuming I correctly summarized, why don't you tell the audience how to best get in touch with you, and of course they should follow you on LinkedIn, where you post a tremendous number of very useful papers and whatnot. But why don't you tell the folks how to get in touch with you, and we'll go from there.
Thanks, David. So LinkedIn is, if in doubt, I'm active on LinkedIn, so feel free to connect to me on LinkedIn. Email is donal.o'connell@chawton-ip-solutions.com. If anyone has any questions or wants to learn more, but obviously, David, if they know you well as well, connect to you, and we can pass on the introductions that way. We've been working together for a long time and stay well connected. So, but thanks again for the opportunity.
Thank you again, Donal. So thank you everyone for tuning in to the inaugural episode of Kidon, War Stories from the Cutting Edge of IP Monetization. My name is David L Cohen. I'm the owner of Kidon IP, a consultancy, David L Cohen PC, a law firm, where we provide IP monetizations to clients both large and small. I've just been chatting with Donal O'Connell, Chawton Innovation Services, and we've been talking about IP and IP risk management and the various aspects of what Donal does in that space. So thank you very much. And there we go.
Thanks, David. Be safe. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.